Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today, I wanted to unpack what's wrong with the Assassin Ascendancy in patch 3.26 and look at some of my hopes for what might be seen in 3.27. I was motivated to put this out by the fact that teaser season is about to start, and it's entirely possible that within 12 hours of this video going live, we're going to get our first teasers for 3.27. I think the Assassin has been bad for a very long time in Path of Exile 1. An interesting thing, I had considered making this video, and then there was a really interesting Reddit discussion thread, which I'll put a link to down in the description below, and it was asking exactly the same question, and it inspired me to actually go ahead and make this video, rather than simply having it bouncing around in my head, alongside all of the other ideas and all of the other rubbish that tends to sit there. Let's start by giving a report card to the Assassin. Now, F is used to pay respects these days, but it does have a meaning that predates that, and that is failure. This is the mark that in a school environment says the student didn't really learn the material at all and isn't ready to face anything more challenging. What I've done here is I've taken a pie chart actually from a previous video on the 3.26 meta, and I've reproduced it here. What this does is it has a look at all of the Ascendancies and their popularity on day 13. So you can see here, we've got a huge slice for Berserker, a smaller but still sizable one for Chieftain, Slayer, Necromancer, Elementalist, Pathfinder, Trickster. Now Trickster got a lot better later in the league, and then a bunch of other Ascendancies. One thing you'll notice if you have a look at how much it changes in popularity from one Ascendancy to the next, other than from first to second, there's no really big drops here. Everything's reasonably close to the one above it and the one below it. And then this slice combines the bottom 7, but Juggernaut is not very far behind the Occultist in popularity, and then it's not very far down to Warden, not very far down to Ascendant, Gladiator, or Guardian, or Saboteur. But then, from second last to last, we have an absolute cratering in popularity. It goes from something like 1.8% of the meta to something like 0.5% of the meta. That is a crushing drop that's present there. And this one, of course, is the Assassin. So that's day 13. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, okay, so that's day 13, but didn't Trickster end up being the best Ascendancy this league? Yes, it did. And Trickster was only in 7th position early on. So what changed? I won't go into the Trickster specifically because explaining that would be beyond the scope of this video, but when we have a look at day 42, the Assassin is still 0.5%. The only difference is that the Saboteur is now its neighbor at 0.7%. Then when we have a look at day 120, is still 0.5%, whereas the Saboteur is back around 2%, like it was back on day 13. What we're seeing here is that high-level players are not interested in playing the Assassin. People who league start the Assassin often tend to respec out of it, or alternately, they abandon it and make a new character instead. So what's the deal here? Well, I want to point out firstly, the Assassin Ascendancy as it currently stands supports two main ways that you could build it. The first one is an instant application critical strike damage setup. So you're dealing hit damage, any ailment damage, if you have any at all, is just a little bit of a bonus, but you're there to hit hard, hit fast, and ultimately you're a bit of a glass cannon. This is a functioning build. It tends to scale power charges for reasons that will become obvious when we have a look at the options available on the Assassin, and it tends to do reasonably good damage, but fall over in a stiff breeze. More on this one in a sec. This is a functioning build, but it's not something that's great. The other way that it's typically played is as a poison character. However, there are some real problems here, and that comes down to the fact that Perfect Agony was reworked. Perfect Agony was made much better as a keystone, but this has not led to cohesive builds that use it, and we'll come to that in a sec. It's worth noting the critical strike assassins that use power charge stacking and that also use instant application critical strike damage. These builds are very functioning without being strong. The main problem they suffer is that when you're wanting to run tier 16.5 or tier 17 maps, you have to do the actual map clear phase as well. And whilst you're very good against the bosses of those maps, often it's the map clear phase that's more lucrative. And even if it isn't, it's going to be messy on an Assassin, which is one of the Ascendancies that has the least defensive options. Another Ascendancy that has comparably bad defenses is the Deadeye. The difference is that the Deadeye has so much baked in damage projection that it's able to freeze monsters before taking a hit from them almost all the time. Whereas the Assassin doesn't really have that much damage projection built in, just whatever is on the classic passive tree. So what ends up happening with these glass cannon builds? Well, Inquisitor does the same thing, but does it better. In general, and this is not always true in every situation you could imagine, but taken across the endgame as a whole, Inquisitor just does this better, and Inquisitor can take a few hits. whereas Assassin tends not to be able to take a few hits. So what we've got here is a cohesive game plan that is functional enough. If you want to force the Assassin to work, you can make it work. It's not completely unplayable, but it's unpopular for a reason. It's unpopular because it is just worse than other alternatives, and those other alternatives do mostly the same thing. However, because the core concepts of the build are functional here, I think what we really need is numbers buffs rather than fundamental playstyle changes. So a couple of the notables that get taken sometimes but not always on these crit assassins are Mistwalker and Opportunistic. These are good nodes, but they tend to be the 4th and 5th best nodes for most people, so they'll take one of them and give the other one the miss. And some people build differently. It's not like it's wrong to build differently, but this is just the most popular way of setting it up. So these, I think, would be sensible choices for buffs here. The reason I like the Trickster Ascendancy so much is that when you're playing a Trickster, you're thinking, oh, okay, I've got 3 Ascendancy notables that are pretty obvious for my build. I'm definitely going to take those. But then your 4th one is actually a really tough choice, because whatever you're doing, one step ahead is good. It's always good. It's often not quite good enough to get in your best 4. And the same is true of Heartstopper, and the same is true of Spellbreaker. All 3 of these notables are competing for one spot, and whilst you probably end up taking one step ahead, you at least seriously consider the other 2 choices. You know they're offering you something real. Whereas with the Assassin, it really is, I've got these 3 notables I'm definitely taking, and then my 4th one is a choice between 2 pretty bad options. So making one or both of those better would then add a few more choices in. Now, the power fantasy of an Assassin is definitely someone that's hard to hit, but if you do succeed in landing a real blow on them, they end up going down pretty easily. There's a couple of mechanics in the game like Evasion and Spell Dodge, which isn't used very much now because Spell Suppression generally replaces it, but it is still something that exists in the game. These are the sorts of things that could be given to Mistwalker or Opportunistic as little buffs. And the concrete suggestion I've got here is for grinding your games to at least consider giving a percentage of your evasion rating as extra ward if you allocate Mistwalker. Why do I say ward? Because one of the biggest weaknesses that an Assassin's got is that you evade all the small hits, but the big hit gets through. And when the dice roll in that worst possible way, ward will actually cover you. But ward does not then empower you to take multiple hits in a row. So if it does go down, you probably want to do the Assassin thing and retreat for a little while, and so that you can then recover that ward. Ultimately, it ends up playing similarly to the Ghost Shroud mechanic, which you're probably going to be taking on an Assassin anyway. The idea here is that this is not enough to make the foundation of a tanky Ascendancy, but it's enough that you can have a plan. At least that's the reason that I suggest it. Thematically, I agree with the idea that the power fantasy of an Assassin is that you are somewhat of a glass cannon, but at the moment, the level of fragility is too high for the way the game is at the moment. There's lots of other things grinding your games could do instead here as well. If they want to just play up the theme of being slippery, one thing they could consider is bringing some elemental ailment avoidance in, which then means that there's less investment required to cap elemental ailment avoidance, and before you get to that point, the Assassin will feel like it's often being missed by the most important attacks. Okay, so that's the instant application critical strike side of the Assassin, but I also want to talk about when you don't want to deal instant application damage, when you want to play a poison build. And here, I think there's actually more requirement for changes. One of the fundamental things in Path of Exile 1 is the damage over time cap. This was something that was seen as a bit of a curiosity for a long time in the game's life. Those days are over. The game tracks both damage over time and healing over time, not in the amount of damage per second, but in the amount of damage per minute. And because of technical limitations, both damage over time and healing over time are capped at 2 to the power of 31 hit points per minute. Now, this is basically 35 million damage per second. Once you get from the point that you go from 1 health to full health every single frame, additional healing over time does nothing for you. But when it comes to damage over time, every point up to the damage over time cap is useful. So there is clear support in the Assassin Ascendancy for a critical strike plus poison setup. There's a lot of notables that are set up around that interaction. This is a very unpopular way to build a character at the moment, despite at first glance it looking quite good. And when I say it's very unpopular, amongst high-level characters at the moment, 0.7% of you are using Perfect Agony. On top of that, most of the people that are using Perfect Agony, for reasons we'll get to in a sec, they're playing the Pathfinder, not the Assassin. What we're seeing here is a problem where you can't make a whole package build out of this critical strike poison setup. You can get individual interactions that are good, but you end up missing key components that would be needed in order to make a functioning overall build. So what do you need on these builds? You need critical strike chance, you need critical strike multiplier, you need defense, you need poison damage nodes, you need aura mods, You also probably need a few other utility things as well. And ultimately, you just have 123 points. It's not enough to take all of this. But then on top of this, there is also the other problem, and that is the people who are playing poison, instead, they go for something else that the Pathfinder has that you can only get on an assassin in conjunction with one of the rarest unique items in the game. Let's talk about poison spreading mechanics. I'll start out quickly by comparing it to Ignite. Ignite can be spread by multiple different mechanics. There's a few things that aren't technically spreading the Ignite, but kind of feel a bit like it. So for instance, there's Maven Boots. The main thing I want to talk about here, though, is that you've got access to what I term Pseudoproliferation. This is the exact text. When you kill an ignited enemy, inflict an equivalent Ignite on each nearby enemy. Now, Pseudoproliferation for Ignite is available in 2 places in the game. You can get it on the quite good unique Beric's Respite, and you can get it on the quite bad unique Abrath's Hooves. So that's your first mechanic that can spread Ignites. And what that means is that if I die while I'm on fire, everyone around me catches fire. Then we have Traditional Proliferation, which is I'm on fire, but everyone that's in hug range gets to feel the warmth. Every monster that's on fire doesn't just suffer damage itself, but everything that's within hugging range, and the hug range can vary a bit depending upon the source of your proliferation, they also take that same damage. So you can get this from support gems, you can get it from Cluster Jewel Notable, Fan the Flames, and you can get it most commonly from Searing Exarch Glove Implicits. Now the thing that's interesting here is that there are 2 different mechanics that work in different ways, and they interact pretty well with each other as well. So if you've got both Beric's Respite and Traditional Proliferation from Exarch Gloves, what happens when you set a monster on fire is that it starts out damaging itself and also enemies that might be within 1.5 meters, and then when that monster dies, it then inflicts an equivalent Ignite on anything that's still alive within 2 meters, which then ends up resulting in it chaining further. Okay, so let's talk now about what exists when it comes to poison. Poison does not have any equivalent of Traditional Proliferation at all, but it does have an equivalent of Pseudoproliferation, and this is actually better than what's available on Beric's Respite. With Beric's Respite or Abrath's Hooves, the Pseudoproliferated Ignites, they maintain the duration of the original Ignite. With the 2 sources of Pseudoproliferation of poison, the new poison has its duration changed so that it is exactly 2 seconds. This is not strictly always better, but in general it does tend to be. So effectively, while it's spreading through a pack, it is refreshing the duration. But there are only 2 sources in the entire game of this poison Pseudoproliferation at the moment. The first one is the Pathfinder Ascendancy. The second one is a Tier 0 rarity unique. That unique is Bino's Kitchen Knife. So in short, an assassin, if they want to get any way of spreading their poisons through packs, they either need to use a Mageblood rarity unique that takes up the weapon slot, i.e. very, very sharply changes your options for building the rest of your character, or they need to make do without Pseudoproliferation. They cannot get Traditional Proliferation at all. There is no way of doing so. Now, there have been plenty of times in Path of Exile's history where you would endure this reduced damage projection in exchange for more single target damage. The problem though is that now we start to hit the limits of the damage over time cap. And this is why all of the initial hype for Perfect Agony, including from myself when it was overhauled in 3.25, ended up not really playing out in reality. Perfect Agony does a lot. It's legitimately strong when you have a look at the numbers that are on it, but it's overwhelmingly played on Pathfinders because they can sacrifice damage over time damage elsewhere on their build and then pick up more critical strike chance, and they can also pick up damage projection from the Ascendancy Notable. Then Perfect Agony carries their damage. What happens if you're an assassin? Well, the Assassin Ascendancy is carrying your damage, Perfect Agony is also carrying your damage. You much more easily get to the damage over time cap. Then you hit a point where you want to invest into either damage projection or tankiness, and you just don't have the options to do that. The Assassin unquestionably does more poison DPS than the Pathfinder does, but in practice, what this means is that you just hit the DOT cap sooner, and then after that, you've got poorer choices for filling out the rest of the tree. While Pathfinder is getting juicy nodes into their 90s that are raising their damage, you're sitting there thinking, I don't really have anything that will increase my damage because I'm already DOT capped. What else can I do? And you're not really coming up with very much. Ultimately, your damage projection clusters are not great in this area, except for a couple of specific use cases. Your defense clusters in the area are not great, except for a number of obvious best ones that you are definitely already taking, but you've already used all of those up. You're locked in the spot in the tree that's defined by Perfect Agony and all the critical strike nodes. You can't go on some massive skill grimmage to other places, but then at the same time, you're just not finding everything you need there. Now, there was a time in Path of Exile's history where player power was lower, an assassin would hit the DOT cap and the Pathfinder would not, and that would be a genuine trade-off. There'd be some people would say, you know what, I prefer what Pathfinder's got as a whole package. Other people would be like, haha, DPS goes up, I'm choosing Assassin. But that's in the past. Nowadays, player power has gone up so much higher that the Assassin just gets there earlier. And really, it comes down to a question. What would you prefer? More single target damage days 1 to 10 of a league, or would you prefer to have superior damage projection all throughout the league? I think overwhelmingly, people are going to choose the second. Not necessarily every single individual, and that's why there are still people playing the Assassin, but it is overwhelmingly more popular to play a Pathfinder on a perfect Agony poison build. So let's talk about some proposed changes here. The first thing is that I think there is a notable in Ruthless on the Assassin that is available only in that game mode. It's not available in the regular game, and it is really, really good. It's the Ruthless exclusive version of Toxic Delivery. This is intended to be weaker than Toxic Delivery in the main game. Much of the time it is, but this is really build enabling. This is the sort of thing you can look at and say, hey, this turns on entire new ways to play a character. If you wanted to play an Energy Blade poison build, well, you can do it. Maybe you can be direct attacks, maybe you can use Blade Trap, it's all up to you. Toxic Delivery would empower that if we had the Ruthless version of it. On top of that, there's Ephemeral Edge, there's Rebuke of the Vile, all sorts of weapons that at the moment, if you want to poison with them, it's pretty much Original Sin or don't bother. There are a couple of other options, but they are just so much worse that they end up just being terrible choices all around. I do not think this should replace the existing Toxic Delivery, and the existing Toxic Delivery is good enough that people who are playing poison builds won't take it anyway. This should instead be a new node. Many people will have no interest in it, that's fine. But that key effect, all damage with hits can poison, will empower a lot of cool things, whether it be weapon attack builds doing elemental damage and still managing to poison, or whether it be spell builds that do elemental damage and poison. The Assassin would then have the tools to build around with these, see if they're any good or not. If it turns out they're not good, at least they'll be interesting and new, even if they're not particularly great. The second idea was one that I had when I was thinking about the Assassin, what sort of defenses could it realistically have? And one of the things that came up is you've probably been exposed to a bunch of your own poisons. So why not make it so that you are very, very resilient to chaos damage? And when I was thinking about that, I got thinking, well, maybe that would be something that could be interesting in conjunction with a low life playstyle, because low life characters have to solve poison damage somehow. And that got me thinking, well, there's no way to really play around with low life poison at the moment. There's not very many payoffs for it. There are some payoffs, but they're not very good. And there's a lot of investment that's required to make low life builds stable. You need to have Chevron's wrappings, or you need massively overcapped chaos resistance, or you need coruscating elixir, and a couple of other solutions, but all of them end up requiring quite a lot of investment on your character. The other thing, of course, is that chaos damage is something that you need to take up a lot of suffixes on your gear in order to mitigate, and if you can get those through your Ascendancy, then that's going to put you into a substantially better spot in order to fill out the rest of your gear slots with different types of defenses instead. So the numbers might be wrong here, but the thought that I had was to consider this as a 4-pointer that is behind that previous node, that is similar to the currently existing Ruthless version of Toxic Delivery. 75% chaos resistance to your character, so that's going to put you to 15% baseline. You need to get a little bit more, but not a huge amount. 75% of chaos damage does not bypass energy shield. This means if you want to play low life, you can. If you don't want to play low life, you're not really forced to. And then when you're on low life, 15% more critical strike chance and 15% more poison damage. Ultimately, what I was really going for here is something that provides a defensive solution that solves some of the weaknesses the Assassin has there, but does so in what I feel is a somewhat thematically appropriate way, that feels very different to the defenses that are available for the Trickster, and that also makes a cohesive overall package. I'm not sure that this would be perfectly balanced as it is. Maybe the numbers on it are completely wrong, but I think it would be an interesting thing to experiment with because there'd be entirely new builds around it. They may not be particularly good, but at least the finding out process would be fun. But then I think the most important thing is that I think the Assassin needs a unique way to spread poisons, something that cannot be taken by Pathfinder builds, something that feels mechanically different to how the Pathfinder does it, which is while your flasks are on, you gain Pseudoproliferation. While Bino's kitchen knife can provide this on an Assassin at the moment, and Forbidden Jewels can at least provide it to Ranger classes, I feel like there's space for the Assassin to have something that's a little bit different. My thought process here was, why not have something that is tied to critical hits, and specifically, when you apply a poison with a critical strike, apply an equivalent poison to each other enemy within 2.5 meters. This, I feel, would solve a lot of the Assassin's issues. I'm not sure that the numbers on that are right. The balance could be way off. But the intention here is to create a unique reason to consider playing the Assassin that does something different to the way the Pathfinder does it. Pathfinder would still have better clear because the Pathfinder's ability to pseudo-proliferate poisons would chain through entire packs, whereas this would only copy poisons at the time they're first applied. But by closing some of the gap, and also potentially giving you the option of later getting Bino's kitchen knife involved as well, so that you can get the best of both worlds, this I think would provide some new options for the Assassin that again, not everyone would want to take, but that I think would be compelling to at least consider. Anyways, that's my thoughts on the state of the Assassin. It is not in a good place in 3.26, it needs to be in a better place in the future, and some ideas on how I'd fix it. Ultimately though, it's going to be up to Grinding Gear Games to come up with their own ideas. Maybe they'll use something that's similar to what I've suggested. Maybe they'll take some ideas out of the Reddit thread. Maybe they'll do something else entirely. One thing they've done pretty well recently is when they've overhauled Ascendancies, with the possible exception of the Warden, they've tended to really nail them. The Trickster, the Chieftain, the Gladiator, and the Warden are the last ones that I can think of that got thorough overhauls. The Chieftain has strong reasons to want to consider playing it. The Trickster is similar. The Gladiator is similar. The Warden does have some unique powerful abilities. It's somewhat overshadowed though by the other Ascendancies on the same class being really good, and also by the fact that the things that the Warden can do, often other Ascendancies can do better. So where the Warden hasn't been a complete hit, the other ones have been, and hopefully the Assassin ends up being in a really good spot. For 327, because it has been a long time since the Assassin has been popular. Anyways, you've stuck to the end of the video, where some people would plug a sponsor at this point. I'm instead going to plug my side project. I've been working on a project that is not really Path of Exile related, although slightly Path of Exile inspired, and this is a litRPG science fantasy web novel that is being serialized here on YouTube. I'll put a link to my second channel down in the description below if you're interested in checking that out. And whether you're interested or not, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results.